Imagine a woman so feared that entire families whispered her name only behind closed doors. A woman whose crimes were so violent, so relentless, that even hardened lawmen refused to confront her alone. In 1829, that woman was Patty Cannon, one of the most ruthless figures in early American history. She built her power on terror, hunting African Americans, abducting them, and operating a kidnapping ring that stretched across state lines. Her story isn't just dark, it's almost unbelievable. And yet, every detail you're about to hear is real. Today, we revisit the chilling legacy of Patty Cannon, the woman whose actions left communities traumatized for generations. Before we begin, make sure you subscribe so you never miss any of these deep historical investigations. And tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, let's go back to 1829. In the early 19th century, along the border between Delaware and Maryland, there existed a woman whose name would become synonymous with terror. Not the kind of terror that storms across battlefields with uniforms and flags, but the kind that crept through dark roads at midnight. The kind that struck families in their homes when they thought themselves safe. Her name was Patty Cannon, and what she did, the methodical hunting, the kidnapping, the cold execution of human beings, would shock the conscience of a nation already fractured by the question of slavery itself. But here's what makes her story different. She was not a slaveholder protecting an institution. She was not enforcing laws written by others. Patty Cannon operated in the margins, in the spaces between law and lawlessness, between states, between the protection that borders promised and the violence they actually concealed. She hunted African Americans, both the enslaved and the free, not because a system demanded it of her, but because she built her own system around it. She created a network of cruelty that would span decades and claim dozens, perhaps hundreds of lives. For more than 30 years, Patty Cannon ran what could only be called a death factory disguised as a sanctuary. People came to her seeking help, seeking passage north, seeking freedom. Some came because they were enslaved and had heard rumors of assistance. Others came because they were free but lived in constant fear of being kidnapped into slavery. What they found instead was a woman waiting to exploit every desperate circumstance, every impossible choice, every moment of vulnerability. The question that haunts this story is not whether she was capable of such violence. The evidence is overwhelming and documented. The question is how she operated for so long in a region of the country already shaped by slavery's horrors, and how so many people knew what she was doing and did so little to stop her. This is the account of Patty Cannon, not a monster born into monstrosity, not a woman driven mad by circumstances beyond her control, but a rational actor who calculated risk and reward, who built relationships with powerful people, who understood exactly what she was doing and who did it anyway. This is the documentation of organized predation against the most vulnerable people in her world. This is 1829, the year her activities began to unravel, and the legacy she left behind. To understand Patty Cannon, you must first understand the world in which she operated. The Chesapeake Peninsula, particularly the border regions between Maryland and Delaware, existed in a state of constant tension during the early 1800s. Maryland was a slave state. Delaware was technically a free state after the Declaration of Independence, yet slavery persisted there in a degraded, uncertain form. This contradiction created opportunity, not for freedom, but for exploitation. Free African Americans lived in Delaware in numbers that troubled Southern slaveholders. They had escaped bondage or been freed through various legal mechanisms. They owned small plots of land. They worked trades. They had built communities that, while constrained by laws and customs, offered something that the slave states below them could not: the possibility of autonomy. The mere existence of these communities represented a threat to the entire economic and social structure that slavery depended upon. At the same time, enslaved people from Maryland and other slave states looked north to Delaware with longing. Somewhere across those invisible lines drawn on maps existed the theoretical promise of freedom. This hope, fragile and desperate, would prove to be the weapon that Patty Cannon wielded against them. The geography itself was maze-like. Swamps, forests, isolated roads, and rivers created natural hiding places. Law enforcement was minimal. The state lines existed more as abstractions than realities on the ground. A person could cross from one jurisdiction to another in minutes, yet the legal consequences of that crossing could mean everything. This landscape, with its physical features and its legal ambiguities, became Patty Cannon's hunting ground. Patty Cannon was born into modest circumstances. Records of her early life are fragmentary, yet what we know suggests a childhood of hardship and instability. Her family struggled economically. The world she inherited was one where women had almost no independent power, no property rights, no official voice in their own fate. For someone like Patty, this reality would have been deeply constraining. But Patty Cannon possessed something that transcended the normal limitations placed on women of her era. She possessed ruthlessness. She possessed the ability to see human beings, particularly those already marked as vulnerable by law and custom, as commodities to be bought, sold, and disposed of. Whether this capacity came from her upbringing, from psychological factors unknowable to us now, or from something else entirely, we cannot say with certainty. What we can say is that she understood the economy of desperation better than almost anyone around her. She married a man named Jesse Cannon, who came from a somewhat more established family. Jesse Cannon became her partner in what would develop into her criminal enterprise, though it remains historically uncertain to what degree he was driving force versus willing accomplice. The most reliable evidence suggests he was second to her. She was the architect. She was the decision maker. She was the one whose name inspired fear. By the 1810s, Patty Cannon had established herself in a house that straddled the Maryland-Delaware border, positioned on a farm that gave her isolation and strategic advantage. The house became known throughout the region as a place where people could be made to disappear. The business she ran was kidnapping and human trafficking, conducted with an efficiency and brutality that would only be exceeded by the scale of the Middle Passage itself. Patty Cannon's operation functioned according to a clear logic. First came the intelligence gathering. She cultivated an extensive network of informants: poor white farmers, tavern keepers, ferry operators, and others who existed on the margins of respectability. These informants identified targets: free African Americans who could be seized and sold back into slavery, enslaved people who might be traveling, anyone whose absence might not be immediately noticed or whose resistance might be overcome. Second came the apprehension. Victims would be captured on roads, at ferry crossings, or at isolated locations. The captures were violent. Resistance was met with immediate force. Once seized, the captives were brought to Cannon's house, where they were held in conditions of brutal confinement. The cellar and outbuildings of her property became a prison. Third came the monetization. Patty Cannon sold her captives to slave traders who operated the circuits between the Chesapeake and the Deep South. These traders bought enslaved and re-enslaved people in bulk and transported them for resale at markets in Virginia, Georgia, and Louisiana. Cannon served as a supplier in this trafficking network. She provided the human cargo. Finally came the destruction of evidence. Many of those brought to her house simply disappeared. No record was made of their arrival or their fate. Bodies were buried in her yard or disposed of in the nearby swamps. No family could retrieve a body for burial. No community could grieve publicly. These people were erased. The efficiency of this system depended on several factors. First, the victims were people whose disappearance would not trigger official investigation. Free African Americans were not citizens. Enslaved people were property, and the loss of property belonged to the owner, not to the authorities. Second, the victims came from a region already marked by violence and predation. One more, kidnapping barely registered in a landscape where kidnapping was endemic. Third, Patty Cannon built relationships with people in power. Constables, judges, and landowners who either protected her or simply chose not to interfere. Patty Cannon did not operate in isolation. She was part of an infrastructure. The people who came to her seeking human merchandise were not anomalies or exceptions. They were participants in a vast, organized system of human trafficking that operated throughout the Atlantic world during this period. One of the most significant figures connected to Patty Cannon's operation was Joe Johnson, a trader from Tennessee who established a way station near her property. Johnson did not capture people himself. He purchased them from suppliers like Cannon. He accumulated them, sorted them, and moved them south. The relationship between Cannon and Johnson reveals the interdependence of this system. Cannon needed buyers. Johnson needed suppliers. Together, they created a pipeline of human suffering. The coffle, the chain gang of enslaved or re-enslaved people being transported to the slave markets of the Deep South, represented the end point of Cannon's work. These columns of humanity, shackled and marched southward, were the final product of her enterprise. They disappeared into the labor camps of the expanding cotton frontier. Many would never see the regions they came from again. The reason this system was so effective was that it exploited the fragmentation of American law. In the 1820s, there was no federal law against kidnapping, no interstate law enforcement mechanism, no unified approach to slavery or freedom. Each state operated according to its own logic. Maryland recognized slavery. Delaware technically did not, yet slavery persisted there anyway. Pennsylvania was further north and had gradually abolished slavery, yet slave catchers operated there openly. These contradictions were not accidental. They were structural. They created the exact conditions under which someone like Patty Cannon could thrive. The communities of free African Americans that had developed in Delaware and the Chesapeake region represented something unprecedented in American history. These were people who had claimed or been granted their freedom, and they had used that freedom to build lives of relative autonomy. They owned land. They practiced trades. They built churches. They created networks of mutual aid and protection. And they lived in constant terror. The terror came from multiple directions. State laws had been tightening throughout the 1810s and 1820s, restricting the movement of free African Americans, requiring papers and documentation, placing them under increased surveillance. Southern slaveholders viewed the very existence of free African American communities as a threat to the entire slave system. A slave who could see free people living in the same region would be tempted to escape. An abolitionist might be inspired to help them. The solution was containment and intimidation. Patty Cannon and the traders and kidnappers who worked alongside her provided a mechanism for reducing the free African American population. They did not use the state apparatus to do it. They worked outside and beneath the law, removing people from communities, from families, from the networks that sustained them, and selling them into slavery. The response from within these communities was to fortify. Free African Americans organized watchers and protectors. They created safe houses. They shared information about which routes were dangerous, which people could be trusted, which areas to avoid. When someone went missing, communities investigated. They tried to trace what happened. They attempted to recover people from slavery if possible. But these efforts were always defensive and always insufficient. The predation was too systematic, too organized, too deeply embedded in the economy and the law. The question of how Patty Cannon operated for so long cannot be answered by focusing on her alone. It requires examining the many people and institutions that protected her, enabled her, or simply looked away. County officials in both Maryland and Delaware were aware of her activities. There is strong evidence that some were paid for their silence or complicity. Others may have simply believed that kidnapping African Americans was not a serious crime worthy of investigation. The status of African Americans in this region was so ambiguous, so contested, that their victimization could be overlooked or rationalized. The taverns and boarding houses that served as way stations in Cannon's network operated openly. The traders who purchased her captives conducted business with a certain brazenness. These were not hidden operations. People talked about them. Rumors circulated. And yet official action remained minimal. There is another form of complicity worth examining: the silence of those who knew but said nothing, who benefited indirectly from the system, or who were afraid to challenge it. If officials were corrupt, they had leverage over everyone else. If Cannon had connections to powerful people, questioning her became dangerous. Fear, corruption, and economic interest created a barrier around her activities that was nearly impenetrable. This barrier would only begin to crack in 1829, when the structure of her enterprise finally became impossible to ignore, when the violence she had committed became undeniable even to those who wished to deny it. Ann Johnson was a free African American woman living in Delaware in the late 1820s. She had family, community, connections. She was not an abstraction, but a person with a name and a history and a place in the world. What happened to Ann Johnson represents in many ways the typical operation of Patty Cannon's enterprise. Johnson disappeared in 1828. There is evidence that she was kidnapped by men working for Cannon, brought to Cannon's house, held there in confinement, and then sold to traders for transport to the Deep South. But Ann Johnson's case would become significant for a different reason. She was not kept isolated. She was not quickly disposed of. She remained in Cannon's confinement long enough to learn information and, more importantly, to be rescued. The rescue of Ann Johnson came through the efforts of people within the African American community who noticed her disappearance, who investigated, and who discovered where she was being held. The rescue itself was dangerous. It required coordination. It required people willing to take enormous risks. But the rescue of Ann Johnson did something that Patty Cannon could not tolerate. It created evidence. The rescued woman could testify. She could describe her captors. She could identify the location. She could describe what happened to other people in Cannon's confinement. This case, more than any other, would eventually bring attention to Patty Cannon's operations in a way that could not be ignored. For those who were not rescued, the experience of being in Patty Cannon's confinement was designed to break resistance and prepare people psychologically for enslavement. The conditions were terrible. Food was minimal. Hygiene was impossible. People were beaten. Women were assaulted. The psychological torment was constant. The transport south was a nightmare of a different kind. Chained together in coffles, people were marched for hundreds of miles toward the slave markets of the Deep South. The journey could take weeks or months. People died along the way from disease, starvation, and abuse. Those who died were simply abandoned. Those who survived were sold into chattel slavery, their identities and histories erased. The money generated by these transactions was distributed among Cannon, the traders, and the various intermediaries. Estimates suggest that over the course of her career, Cannon's operation generated significant wealth. This wealth was not hidden. It was visible in property ownership, in improved conditions at her house, in her ability to maintain her lifestyle and her protection. The disposal of those who could not be sold, the sick, the extremely aged, those who were injured or damaged, represented another category of crime. There is strong evidence that Cannon had people killed at her house. Bodies were disposed of in ways meant to prevent identification or recovery. Families never learned what happened to the relatives. They simply disappeared. The voices of Patty Cannon's victims come to us fragmentary and incomplete. Some survived and left testimonies. Some left letters or documents. Some were remembered by family members who recorded what happened to them. One account describes a woman named Rachel Parker, enslaved in Maryland, who had been told by Patty Cannon that she could help her escape to freedom. Instead, Cannon captured her, held her, and sold her back into slavery. Rachel Parker's family searched for her for years. They believed her lost forever until, by chance, they discovered her in a slave market in Georgia. Only through enormous effort and expense were they able to purchase her back. But Rachel Parker's case was exceptional. Most people who fell into Cannon's hands were never recovered. They remain unknown, their stories lost, their deaths unrecorded. There are accounts from people who escaped Cannon's house. These accounts describe the sound of screams from the cellar, the smell of violence, the knowledge that people disappeared and were never seen again. The trauma that survivors carried for the rest of their lives was profound. One survivor described Patty Cannon herself in detail. A woman of medium height, with a commanding presence, with an ability to inspire absolute obedience in her followers. She was neither physically imposing nor particularly educated, yet she exercised control over everyone around her through force of will, through knowledge of their vulnerabilities, through the threat of violence. These testimonies taken together create a picture of systematic predation, of cold calculation, of a woman who understood what she was doing and who did it with full consciousness of its consequences. In 1829, the structure that had protected Patty Cannon for decades began to fracture. The rescue of Ann Johnson created a legal and practical opening that had not existed before. For the first time, there was a complaint that could not be easily dismissed. There was a victim who could provide testimony. There were physical locations that could be searched. There were witnesses within the community who had protected knowledge and who now had reason to come forward. The investigation that followed, while slow and frustrating by modern standards, represented an unprecedented effort to document Cannon's crimes. Authorities in Delaware began interviewing people who had connections to her operation. They interviewed workers at her house. They interviewed traders and intermediaries. They interviewed people who had disappeared and were rescued, people who had lost family members, people who had heard rumors. What emerged from these interviews was not a complete picture. Such completeness was impossible, but a clear outline of systematic kidnapping and murder spanning decades. In 1829 and 1830, Patty Cannon faced criminal charges in Delaware. The charges included kidnapping and receiving stolen property, since enslaved people were legally property. She was also implicated in murders, though these charges were more difficult to prosecute given the absence of bodies and the difficulty of proving intent. The trial itself became a sensation, attracting public attention and newspaper coverage throughout the Atlantic states. For the first time, the organized kidnapping operation in the Chesapeake region was being publicly documented and prosecuted. Witnesses testified. Evidence was presented. The scale of the Chesapeake operation became undeniable. Patty Cannon's defense, such as it was, focused on minimizing her role and her knowledge. She claimed that she had only been following the law as it was written, that she had not kidnapped anyone personally, that others had committed crimes at her property without her knowledge or consent. This defense was not credible, and it was not believed by those who heard it. Patty Cannon was convicted and sentenced to death. The execution did not take place immediately. She was imprisoned in the Smyrna jail in Delaware, awaiting her sentence to be carried out. In 1829, while in confinement, Patty Cannon died. The official cause was apoplexy, a sudden illness. But there are accounts that suggest suicide, that she deliberately poisoned herself rather than face execution. The truth of what happened in her cell remains uncertain. What is certain is that her death prevented the public spectacle of her execution. It prevented the final reckoning, the moment when her crimes would have been documented in detail in the public sphere. Her death became, in some ways, another form of erasure, easier to forget, easier to move past, easier to contain. Yet her operation did not end with her death. The network she had built outlived her. The traders continued their business. The kidnappings continued, though at a reduced scale. It would take years and the eventual mobilization of abolitionists and activists to begin to shut down the systematic trafficking in the region. The removal of Patty Cannon from the scene did not eliminate the infrastructure of kidnapping and trafficking. The traders continued their work. The informants continued to identify victims. The constables and officials who had been complicit continued to look away. However, Cannon's death marked a turning point. The attention that her trials had generated did not disappear. Activists and abolitionists who had been working in relative obscurity now had documented evidence of organized kidnapping. They used this evidence to build larger movements. Thomas Garrett, a white Quaker living in Wilmington, Delaware, became one of the central figures in the effort to combat kidnapping in the region. Working with African American communities and with other abolitionists, Garrett established safe houses and helped people escape north. He documented cases of kidnapping. He pursued legal action when possible. The Philadelphia Anti-Slavery Society used the revelations about Patty Cannon's operation to raise awareness about the kidnapping problem. Pamphlets were printed and distributed. Public meetings were held. The question of kidnapping and trafficking became tied to the larger abolitionist movement. Over the course of the 1830s and 1840s, the coordinated efforts of these activists and community members began to reduce, though not eliminate, the systematic kidnapping that had been endemic to the region. Yet even as these efforts moved forward, the impulse toward denial and minimization was also at work. Regional historians and politicians in Delaware and Maryland attempted to characterize Patty Cannon as an aberration, a lone criminal rather than a representative of broader systems. This narrative was false. Patty Cannon did not operate in a vacuum. She operated within a framework that society had created. The laws that made African Americans vulnerable to kidnapping, the economic incentives that made trafficking profitable, the institutional corruption that made enforcement difficult. These were not accidents. They were structural features of a society built on slavery and racial exploitation. Yet the desire to see Cannon as exceptional, as a rare monstrosity rather than an expression of ordinary cruelty, has persisted in historical memory. For a long time, her story was almost forgotten. It appeared in specialized academic studies but not in popular histories. It was acknowledged but not fully reckoned with. This forgetting is itself significant. It represents a kind of social amnesia, a willingness to erase evidence of horror when that evidence becomes too uncomfortable to confront. In recent decades, historians, particularly those working in African American studies and the history of slavery, have recovered Patty Cannon's story. They have tracked down documents, assembled testimonies, reconstructed networks, and placed her activities in context. What emerges from this recovered memory is not a monster, but a human being acting within and shaped by the systems available to her. This realization is in some ways more disturbing than the simple narrative of the exceptional criminal. It suggests that Patty Cannon was not uniquely evil, but rather uniquely willing to enact the violence that the society around her made possible. Her story forces us to confront the reality of how ordinary people participated in extraordinary violence, how economic systems shaped human behavior, how institutions failed the vulnerable, and how entire communities could know about crimes and do nothing. It also suggests that resistance was possible. The people who rescued Ann Johnson, who testified against Cannon, who pursued justice even when the system was against them, these people demonstrated that action was always an option, even when difficult and dangerous. Patty Cannon is not well known in popular American history. She does not appear in most textbooks. She is not a household name. Yet her story illuminates something crucial about how slavery and racial violence operated in the 19th century United States. The image of slavery that dominates American consciousness focuses on the plantation and the large-scale slaveholder class. This image is important and necessary, but it is incomplete. Slavery also operated through trafficking, through kidnapping, through the activities of people like Patty Cannon, who existed on the margins of the system, but were absolutely essential to its functioning. The trading networks that moved enslaved people from the Upper South to the Deep South represented a crucial part of the slave economy. These networks kept the system alive by continuously redistributing enslaved people, by converting free people into enslaved people, by maintaining the supply of labor for expanding regions. Patty Cannon operated at the point of capture in this system. She was involved in the initial seizure of victims. Others handled transport, sale, and integration to the labor system. But her role was indispensable. Without people like her, the system would have lacked supply. Without the kidnapped and re-enslaved people she provided, the expansion of slavery into new territories would have been more difficult. Understanding this, understanding that Cannon was not exceptional but representative, requires us to see slavery not as a simple relationship between a planter and an enslaved person, but as a vast, interconnected infrastructure of violence that touched almost every aspect of American life. The people who were kidnapped by Patty Cannon and her associates had families. They had descendants. They had communities that remembered them, that mourned them, that attempted to recover them. Some families, like Rachel Parker's, managed to bring their relatives back. But these cases were exceptional, dependent on luck, resources, and determination. Most families never found out what happened. They lived with uncertainty. Did the missing person die? Were they sold into slavery? Were they in the Deep South? Would they ever return? The trauma of this uncertainty persisted through generations. Families were fractured. The sense of security was shattered. The knowledge that someone you loved could simply disappear, could be stolen away, created ongoing psychological injury. And yet, the descendants of those who were kidnapped and enslaved are still here. They survived, despite the systematic attempt to reduce them to property, to erase them, to eliminate them from history. Their survival is itself an act of resistance. The recovery of their stories is an act of justice. Patty Cannon died in 1829 before her execution. The government executions that might have created a final public accounting never took place. Her body was not preserved. Her gravesite has been lost. This incompleteness is characteristic of American reckoning with slavery and racial violence. There were no Nuremberg trials for the architects of slavery. There were no truth and reconciliation commissions that brought perpetrators and victims together. There was no comprehensive accounting of crimes committed. Instead, there was only the slow, difficult work of memory and recovery, conducted largely by those descended from the victims, often against the resistance of institutions and societies that preferred to forget. In recent years, there have been efforts to recover and memorialize sites associated with Patty Cannon's crimes. There have been historical markers and educational initiatives. There has been scholarship and documentation. But full reckoning remains elusive. How do you reckon with a crime that touched hundreds of people, that erased countless lives, that was made possible by institutional structures and supported by complicity? The answer, perhaps, is that reckoning is not a single event, but an ongoing process. It is the recognition that these crimes happened. It is the recovery of the names and stories of victims. It is the examination of how ordinary people participated in extraordinary violence. It is the commitment to ensuring that such violence is not repeated. The story of Patty Cannon raises questions that extend far beyond her individual case. It asks us to think about how violence becomes possible, how institutions enable cruelty, how complicity operates, how ordinary people make choices that have extraordinary consequences. It raises the question of responsibility. Was Patty Cannon solely responsible for her crimes? Or was she operating within a system that made such crimes possible, profitable, and protected? The answer surely is that both things are true. She was responsible for her individual choices and her actions. But those choices and actions were made possible by structures and systems that many people helped to create and maintain. It raises the question of accountability. How do we hold people accountable for crimes committed in the distant past? How do we reckon with institutional complicity? How do we honor victims whose names we will never know? It raises the question of memory. What do we choose to remember, and what do we choose to forget? What does our historical memory reveal about ourselves and our commitments? It raises the question of resistance. What does it mean to resist when resistance is dangerous? What can individuals do in the face of systematic violence? How do communities protect their members from predation? These questions are not merely historical, they are urgent and contemporary. Systems of violence and predation persist. Complicity remains widespread. Resistance continues to be necessary and difficult. Patty Cannon's name, which was once known throughout the Chesapeake region with horror and fear, has largely faded from public consciousness. She is not remembered in the way that prominent slaveholders are remembered. She has no statues or monuments. Her house, which stood as a place of terror for so long, no longer exists. And yet, her story persists. It persists because historians have recovered it. It persists because descendants of her victims have remembered it. It persists because there are people who understand that ignoring this history means failing to understand how violence operates in our world. Among the people kidnapped and harmed by Patty Cannon's operation, some names have been recovered and recorded. Ann Johnson, who was rescued and whose rescue triggered the investigation that would eventually bring Cannon down. Rachel Parker, whose kidnapping and re-enslavement into slavery her family eventually documented. And others, dozens more, whose names appear in trial records, in testimonies, in the fragmentary documents that survived. But for every name we know, there are many we will never know. There are people who disappeared completely, whose existence is acknowledged only by the absence, only by the families who mourned them, only by the gaps in community records where their names should have appeared. The investigation into kidnapping and trafficking in the Chesapeake region that was triggered by Patty Cannon's capture continued for decades. As the abolitionist movement grew stronger, the attention to kidnapping grew as well. But even as slavery itself was finally abolished in 1865, the practices of kidnapping and trafficking did not disappear. They continued, changing forms, finding new victims, adapting to new legal frameworks. The work of documenting these crimes, of recovering these stories, of ensuring that they are not forgotten, continues into the present day. It is work that is never finished, that requires constant commitment and attention. Patty Cannon never faced full justice. She died in prison before her execution. She was never forced to confront the full weight of her crimes. The people she killed, the families she destroyed, the communities she terrorized. They never received official acknowledgement of what was done to them. But justice, perhaps, is not something that can be delivered by courts or governments to cases centuries old. Justice in this context might mean something different. It might mean recovery of memory. It might mean naming the victims. It might mean understanding how the crime was possible. It might mean committing ourselves to ensuring that such crimes do not happen again. This incomplete justice is perhaps the best we can hope for. It requires work. It requires honesty. It requires willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about our societies and our histories. The story of Patty Cannon is a story of individual agency and structural violence. It is a story of how one woman exploited the vulnerabilities created by slavery and racial oppression. It is a story of how many people enabled her to continue her crimes through complicity, corruption, and silence. It is a story of how communities of African Americans resisted and survived. It is a story of how truth eventually emerges, even when powerful forces work to suppress it. It is also a story that reminds us that history is not settled. The recovery of Patty Cannon's story happened only in recent decades, when historians and community members decided that this memory was worth preserving. There are many other stories like this, stories of crimes and victims that remain obscure, that remain hidden, that remain unrecovered. To truly reckon with American history, with the history of slavery, of racial violence, of exploitation, we must be willing to dig into these obscure corners. We must be willing to recover names and stories. We must be willing to examine our own complicity with the systems of violence. We must be willing to ask hard questions and to sit with uncomfortable answers. Patty Cannon is dead. The people she kidnapped and killed are dead. The regional economy that made her operation possible has transformed. But the legacy persists. It persists in the descendants of those who were victimized. It persists in the institutional structures that continue to enable violence against vulnerable populations. It persists in the ways that we choose or fail to remember. This is the story of 1829. This is the story of Patty Cannon. This is the story of people kidnapped, exploited, and killed. This is the story of communities that resisted and survived. This is the story that demands to be told again and again until the memory is secure, until the truth is acknowledged, until the victims are honored. It is a story that is finished and yet remains unfinished. It is a story from the past and yet speaks urgently to the present. It is a story of individual monstrosity and collective responsibility. It is a story we must continue to tell.